Hey guys, I'm reading Healing the Child Within. I'm having problems with this tripod, so I know the picture isn't that great. I'm going to try and move it a little closer. Okay, you can see my cat in the background. Okay, chapter 11, the process of grieving. A trauma is a loss. A trauma is a loss, whether a real loss or a threatened one. We experience a loss when we are deprived or have to go without something that we have had and valued, something that we needed, wanted, or expected. Minor losses or trauma are so common and subtle that we often do not recognize them as being a loss, yet all of our losses produce pain or unhappiness. We call this pain and train of feelings grief. We can also call it the grieving process. When we allow ourselves to feel these painful feelings, give them an accurate name, and when we share the grief with safe and supportive others over time, we are able to complete our grief work and thus be free of it. To complete our grief work takes time. The bigger the loss, the longer the time generally required. For a minor loss, we may complete most of the grieving in a few hours, days, or weeks. For a moderate loss, this work may take months to a year or longer. And for a major loss, the time required for healthy completion or grieving is usually from 2 to 4 years or longer. Dangers of unresolved grief. Unresolved grief festers like a deep wound covered by scar tissue, a pocket of vulnerability ever ready to break out anew. When we experience a loss or trauma, it stirs up energy within us that needs to be discharged. When we do not discharge this energy, the stress builds up to a state of chronic distress. Kristenberg, 1986, calls it chronic shock. With no release, this chronic distress is stored within us as discomfort or tension that may at first be difficult for us to recognize. We may feel it or experience it through a wide range of manifestations, such as chronic anxiety, tension, fear or nervousness, anger or resentment, sadness, emptiness, unfulfillment, confusion, guilt, shame, or, as is common among many who grew up in troubled family, as a feeling of numbness or no feelings at all. These feelings may come and go in the same person. They may also be difficult sleeping, aches, pains, and other somatic complaints, and full-blown mental or emotional physical illness, including PTSD, may result. In short, we pay a price when we do not grieve in a complete and healthy way. If we suffered losses in our childhood for which we were not allowed to grieve, we may grow up carrying several of the above conditions into and throughout our adulthood. We may also develop a tendency towards self-destruction or other destructive behaviors. These destructive behaviors may cause us and others unhappiness, get us in trouble, and can cause us crisis after crisis. When these destructive behaviors are repeated, they may be called a repetition compulsion. It is as if we have an unconscious drive or compulsion to keep repeating one or more of these behaviors, even though they are not usually in our best interest. Children who grew up in troubled or dysfunctional families suffered numerous losses over which they are unable to grieve in a complete way. The many negative messages that they get when they try to grieve set up a major block, not feeling and not talking about it. When these rules and patterns that are learned as children and adolescents continue into adulthood, they are difficult to change. Yet in healing our child within, in finding, nurturing, and being our true self, we can change these ineffective behaviors and occurrences. If doing so, we begin to break free of the bonds of our repeated and unnecessary confusion and suffering. We first have to identify and name our trauma or losses. Then we can begin to re-experience them, going through our grief work and completing it, rather than trying to go around it or trying to avoid it as we have been doing up until now. Beginning to grieve. Number 1, identify, accurate name our losses. Number 2, identify our needs. 3, identify our feelings and share them. 4, work on core issues. 5, work a recovery program. Identifying our trauma and losses. Identifying a hurt, loss, or trauma may be difficult, especially one that we may have stuffed, repressed, and suppressed. Identifying one, hi Charlie, that happened long ago may be more difficult. While talking about our pain and our concerns may be helpful, simply talking or talk therapy may not be enough to activate feelings of grief around ungrieved losses. That is why experiential therapy or techniques may be helpful in activating and facilitating grief work. Experimental techniques such as group therapy, risking one's real concerns, or family subculture allow a focus and spontaneity that taps into the unconscious processes which otherwise may remain hidden from our ordinary awareness. Only an estimated 12% of our life and our knowledge is in our conscious awareness, and in contrast, 88% that is unconscious awareness. These experimental techniques are helpful not only identifying but also in doing our actual work of grieving. The following are examples of some experimental techniques that may be used to heal our child within through grieving or ungrieved hurts, losses, or traumas. Number 1, risking and sharing, especially feelings, with safe and supportive others. 2, storytelling, telling our own story, including risking and sharing. 3, working through transference, what we project or transfer onto others and vice versa for them. 4, psychodrama, reconstruction, desultory therapy, family sculpture. 5, hypnosis and related techniques. 6, attending self-help meetings. 7, working the 12 steps. 8, group therapy. 9, couples therapy. 8, guided imagery, breathe work, affirmations, dream analysis, meditation and prayer. Therapeutic body work, keeping a journal or diary. These experimental techniques should be used in context the full recovery program, ideally under the guidance of therapist or counselor who knows principles of healing our child within. A loss may be sudden, gradual, or prolonged. It can be partial, complete, or uncertain, or unending. It can occur singly or multiple and cumulative. Always personal, it may also be symbolic. Loss is such a universal experience, but because we encounter it so often, we easily and often overlook it, yet it always carries with it a threat to our self-esteem. Indeed, loss occurs anytime we suffer a blow to our self-esteem. While loss often occurs separately and discreetly, it results grief brings up prior ungrieved losses and we have stored in our unconscious. An ungrieved loss remains forever alive in our unconscious, which has no sense of time. Thus, past losses or even a reminder of the loss, such as current losses or memory of the past losses, evoke fear of future loss in the future. Some examples of loss: important person, separation, divorce, rejection, desertion, abandonment, death, abortion, stillbirth, illness, children leaving home, etc. Part of ourself, body image, illness, accident, loss of function, loss of control, self-esteem, independence, ego, expectations, life, needs, culture shock, job change, etc. Childhood, healthy parenting, getting needs met, healthy development, transitional objects, gain or loss of sibling or other family members, body changes, threats of loss, separation, or divorce. Adult development, transitions including mid-life and older life, external objects, money, property, necessities, car, sentimental objects, collections. In summary, past losses and separations have an impact on current losses, separations, and attachments, and all of these factors bear on fear of future losses and our capacity to make future attachments. Identifying an ungrieved loss is a beginning of getting free of its painful hold on us. Because loss can be such an overwhelming event in recovery from alcohol and other drug dependence and co-alcoholism, codependence, and other effects of trauma, I've considered 10 losses to be grieved in these conditions as further examples for people who may have been affected. 1. Expectations, hopes, and beliefs. 2. Self-esteem. 3. Parts of self. 4. Lifestyle. 5. Instant altered state of consciousness and or pain relief. 6. Past unexperienced relationships. 7. Past incompleted developmental stages. 8. Past and grieved losses and trauma. 9. Changes in current relationships. 10. Threats of future loss. Stages of grief. Acute grief tends to follow an appropriate course, beginning with shock, fear, anxiety, and anger, progressing through more pain and despair. Then it ends on either a positive or negative note, depending on the conditions around the loss and the person's opportunity to grieve it. These stages or phases may be further described by breaking them down in more detailed components. Stage 1, shock, alarm, and denial. 2, acute grief. Continuing, intermediate, lessening, denial, physical and psychological pain and distress. Contractionary pulls, emotions, and impulses. Searching behavior composed of crying, anger, guilt, shame. Anyways, 3, integration of the loss and grief. If the outcome is favorable. Acceptance of the reality of the loss and return to physical and psychological well-being. Diminished frequency and intensity of crying. Restored self-esteem. Focus on the past and the present and future. Ability to enjoy life again. Pleasure-eyed awareness of growth from the experience. Reorganization of a new identity with restitution of the loss and loss remembered with piegarmy and caring instead of pain. If the outcome is unfavorable, the loss with lingering sense of depression, physical aches and pains, of lower self-esteem. Breaking these stages down into components is helpful to our conceptualizing and understanding of the grief process. However, these components are not discrete and sequential. They do not tend to follow each other in a prescribed order. Rather, they tend to overlap and move around the various areas of manifestations listed above. Dana was a 28-year-old woman who grew up in an abusive and actively alcoholic family. In her late teens, she became alcoholic, and 4 years ago, at age 24, she stopped drinking and began treatment for her alcoholism. She had been in a therapy group for adult children of alcoholics and other troubled families for about 2 years, making noticeable progress. When she broke up with her boyfriend, she told the group, "I'm hurting so bad, I'm down to my last hurt, the emptiness is so bad, I broke up with my boyfriend 2 weeks ago. This week I started crying and just couldn't stop. I'm realizing that breaking up is not all that it is making me feel so bad. It is my loss of that little girl inside me. I've been going home every night and crying myself to sleep." Here she cries and takes a long pause. "I just can't believe that little girl was treated as bad as she was, but it's true." In beginning to grieve over one loss, the relationship with her boyfriend, she triggered her unfinished grieving over another loss, the mistreatment and abuse of her child within. This is an example of how grieving is not always as simple as it may first appear. Of course, Dana had been grieving the loss of her child within for a long time, although it was an incomplete way, including through the repetition compulsion of going out with men who mistreated her by not trusting her sponsor in AA and not trusting the therapy group for nearly the first year of joining it. But gradually she began to risk and tell her true story little by little. She is now beginning to break free of the shackles of her false self and repetition compulsion and to heal her child within. To work through the pain of our grieving, we experience our feelings as they come up for us, without trying to change them. Grief is thus active work. It is mental and emotional labor, exhaustive and exhausting. It is so painful that we often try to avoid the pain around it. Some ways that we may try to avoid grieving include continuing to deny the loss, intellectualizing about it, stuffing our feelings, macho mentality, "I'm strong, I can handle it myself," using alcohol or other drugs or addictions attachments, prolonged attempt to get the lost object back. Even though we may get temporary relief by such methods, not feeling our grief only prolongs our pain. Overall, we consume as much energy in avoiding grieving as we would if we went ahead and grieved our loss or trauma. When we feel something as we grieve, we decrease its power over us. In healing our child within, we may discover that we have been avoiding grief work over losses or trauma that happened a long time ago, yet we suffered so much and long through our inability to grieve. For some of us, it may now be time to begin work through and complete our grieving. There are many possible ways to facilitate feeling and experiencing our feelings as they come up for us. I listed several possible experimental techniques under identifying our losses above. The first two of these are among the most readily available to us: risking, sharing, and telling our story with safe and supportive people, which I describe in the next chapter. The next chapter will be chapter 12, continuing to grieve, risking, sharing, and telling our story. Okay? So until next time, hope you enjoyed. You're good enough.